I never thought I'd watch a horror movie where the real life effects of Alzheimer's are 10 times more horrifying than the scares. So The Taking of Deborah Logan is a 2014 found footage horror film directed by Adam Robitel. It stars Jill Larson as Deborah Logan, Michelle Ang as Mia, and Anne Ramsey as Sarah Logan. So the thing about found footage, when it's done well, it can be really awesome. It can be really effective, and you feel like it's real. You feel like you're there with the characters. You feel like you're experiencing whatever they're feeling. But on the flip side, for every great found footage movie, there's about 20 crappy ones. Now, obviously, back in the day, it was started by the cannibal movies, and then it had a resurgence after the Blair Witch Project, but then it died down again. But once movies like Chronicle started coming out, that craze picked back up. And for the last 7 years or so, there have been tons and tons of found footage movies. So, is this one of those great ones, or is it one of those crappy ones? Let's find out. So the premise is very, very interesting. It's about a medical student who is trying to finish her thesis, and to do so, she has to do a documentary and study on Deborah Logan, a woman who is now suffering from Alzheimer's. So with the help of her film crew and Deborah's friends and family, she goes ahead and starts this study. But once the study starts, it doesn't go quite as expected and weird things start to happen. So the story throws you right into the deep end. It starts at the exact moment that they get at the house to start the documentary. It feels really awkward, it feels realistic, it almost feels like it's not going to happen. But Deborah acquiesces and decides to let the study go forward. That is, of course, as long as the crew obeys a few of her ground rules. And I like a lot of the ground rules that she has because they kind of go with her age and her sensibilities. I really didn't expect this story to be as effective as it was. It shows a lot of the actual symptoms that patients with Alzheimer's have and what they suffer through and what their family suffers through and their friends suffer through. Obviously, when your parents are older and you're younger, you have a bit of friction, but when you compound that with Alzheimer's, you definitely have a recipe for some really awkward interactions, and the dynamic of the family gets kind of messed up. All of this is shown very effectively and realistically, especially by Sarah and Deborah themselves. I've known some people that came down with Alzheimer's, and I've been witness to the mood swings and the violent reactions that they have sometimes and the hallucinations, so it's a fairly accurate portrayal of the stuff that you would see in an Alzheimer's patient. The pacing of the film is just right. It kind of matches the degradation of Deborah's mind. As her mind unwinds, then the film does too. It's a slow, methodical pacing. So with it being a found footage, there is a lot of shaky cam, but it's not as much as you would think. The lighting for the most part is very natural. They use ambient light pretty effectively like a real documentary crew would. During the first two acts, there's a lot of things that happen that really matter, especially in the detail of them. You know, the shots where they punch in and they show these things. I talk about punch-ins and detail shots a lot because when a film gets them right, I really want to highlight that because so many films fall into the trap of showing everything in close-up or everything in wide and not knowing how to balance that out. Now, given the nature of Deborah's disease, a lot of these cutaways tend to be pretty sad. So eventually the crew adds CCTV throughout the house so you can see more angles and more things that happen even while they're sleeping. But when used properly, CCTV can be very effective as demonstrated by Paranormal Activity and some of its sequels. I feel like they kind of underused the CCTV in this movie. They show some stuff, but nothing that's super effective. It's more showing transitions from one point to another. For the first two acts of the movie, the editing feels really natural and it aids in the story. It doesn't feel distracting at all. Speaking of distracting, there's quite a few times where they really should just hit a light switch, turn the lights on in the room, and you would see what's going on. It would still be, to me, just as effective and scary, but you'd actually be able to see it better. Now, don't get me wrong, I do love a lot of the dark scenes in this movie, especially when they go into creepy places like the attic or whatever, and there's, shadows and those things that are playing with the lights from the camera. That's effective. Something that you'll find in most found footage films that really, really annoys me are these artificial effects they add to the camera for cuts or just to make it remind you that it's like a digital camera. You'll get these pixelation things or these lines, something that you never actually see when you're recording with your phone or a GoPro or a DSLR or one of the bigger, fancier digital cameras. You almost never see any of that stuff. You're not going to get it just from walking around and recording. It's almost like they're saying, hey, don't forget, it's found footage. For most of the movie, the audio is raw and natural and realistic. There are some audio cues that, tell you when cameras are switching from one to another, or there's something going on around you in the environment, and that works really well, and it doesn't call too much attention to itself. There is a little bit of music in this movie, which I'm not sure why that is, because it's a found footage film. They're showing footage of what happened. Why would they add spooky music to their footage? Oftentimes in horror, silence is golden. You want everything to be as quiet as possible so that when something does happen and there's a big boom or a jump, it scares the crap out of you. If a jump scare feels earned, it's so much better than if it's just thrown in there with some music like a stinger and you're like, ugh. There are a few little details that you see early on that kind of hint that something weird is happening in the house or around them. They don't really make a big deal out of them, they're just kind of shown in passing. When it comes to the world building, it's a very small world. It's these people in this house with this woman who is suffering from Alzheimer's. And because of that, you and the characters are really affected by the things that Deborah is going through because of her disease. Like I said in my intro, it really feels more horrifying than a lot of monster movies would because the disease is just so bad. It just ravages the human mind. I think the use of real-world symptoms to build up to the more supernatural elements of the story is pretty effective. And it makes Deborah come off as equal parts sad and scary. There's a lot of believability in the buildup of the story, and I think that's due to the great performances and really effective use of archival footage. You know, they're watching a documentary at one point, they're talking to an anthropologist. There's all these little things that they do that kind of add to the world and just, goes from being in this little house to a bigger story, even though it's still on a small scale. And I really do think the backstory is pretty awesome. They don't go super in depth with it, but it does give you a reason to start seeing these other things. Something else that really helps with the believability of what Deborah's going through are the makeup effects. They're mostly practical and they are done really well. They look like a legitimate disease that somebody could have. It's nothing to do with Alzheimer's, it's something else. But it works really well and it's pretty gross and creepy. So do the scares take advantage of that spooky world building? Let's find out. There are a bunch of simple shots of Deborah just kind of milling around and not doing much, but they are so spooky. They're really scary and you're always wondering what's going to happen. Is she going to do something? Is something around her going to do something? And you kind of just sit there and it lets it rest for a while and you're thinking, and then that normally pays off in one way or another. Oftentimes, as simple as these shots are, they can be more effective than a lot of things you've seen in other horror films. If the atmosphere and a lot of these spooky shots don't get to you, I'm pretty sure that the body horror in this movie will. It's not grotesque, it's not over the top, it looks pretty real, but I think that's why it's so effective. Honestly, the scares that coincide with Deborah's actual Alzheimer's, I think are just as scary as the supernatural stuff, and I think the whole movie could actually go using those without getting into the supernatural. Which again says a lot for the effectiveness of the movie and their performances. There are quite a few jump scares in the movie, and only a couple of them feel cheap. Most of them are built up to, and I felt like they were earned. Again, a couple of them kind of annoyed me because they added music or sound to them, and since this is a found footage, why would those be there? The whole third act just builds and builds and builds and builds, and you get a lot of tension, you get a lot of scary stuff, you get some really great shots, you get some real creepy things going on.
And now the moment we've all been waiting for is here.
We're out of time.
It's Judgment Day.
This is truly an effective look at Alzheimer's. It has a lot of horror, it has a great narrative, it has so much going for it that is ultimately brought down by that ending. It's marred by all of these distracting cuts and camera effects and everything else instead of letting, the images speak for themselves. I feel like they maybe weren't comfortable enough. They didn't think it'd be spooky enough if they didn't put these effects and the camera going out and the audio going out and everything else, when really that was just more distracting than anything. I think if they'd have been more confident in what they were doing, it would have been better. But it's still very much worth a watch. It's very scary. It's one of the more effective found footage movies you're going to see until that ending. So that's why I'm going to give The Taking of Deborah Logan a 6 out of 10.